I'm Scott Allen Miller. This is the Sam IT channel here on YouTube, and today I want to talk to you about why VisualBasic is the worst possible programming language for your project. Okay, so first of all, in IT, maybe you're not aware of this, but we tend to exaggerate sometimes. And okay, this is one of those times. VisualBasic isn't actually the worst language, but it is a really bad language for your project. And the reason that we get so adamant about it is because it's the worst language that anyone ever actually chooses. You see, the problem is that there are worse languages. Some that people know, like COBOL or Fortran or Delphi, these would all be worse than VisualBasic, like actually worse. They'd be tragic. Well, Fortran has some good places, but COBOL, Delphi? No way. Then there's a bunch of languages that nobody knows that would probably be pretty horrific too. Not that any of these languages are particularly bad, except for COBOL, that's actually that bad. But the general problem with the languages is that they're either old, or they use an archaic style, or they have some major limitations, or there's no implementations of them that are any good, or they're really expensive and just make no sense, or they lack frameworks. There's all kinds of reasons. But if you were looking at like Forth, or Smalltalk, or Common Lisp, these might be even worse than VisualBasic for your project, mostly because nobody knows them and you can't get support. But VisualBasic takes a unique place, it being the one language that's so awful and yet is used so often. And that's why we get so adamant about avoiding it, because we know if we get people to avoid it, they won't consider the other options that are worse. Any option that someone will actually consider will be better. So that's why we get that way, not because it's actually that bad of a language. In reality, VisualBasic is not a horrible language. It's simply that it's not a good choice, and we have an opportunity to protect you from making that bad choice. Real quick, let's give some history. Programming languages go back to roughly 1954. Now, technically, there were languages before 1954. There would have to be because computers had to run. But the first real popular high-level language was Fortran from IBM in 1954. Believe it or not, 1954 till now, that's like 63 years, and Fortran remains a viable language that does some good stuff. Very few people use it, but it is a good language with some benefits, especially in scientific computing, which is what it was meant for. Fortran has held up very well. In 1959, COBOL arose. COBOL was really meant for accounting and financial systems, and generally is an awful language. Its design is terrible. By 1964, people who wanted to do something better and didn't want the scientific and mathematical complexities of Fortran started proposing a new language that was designed to make it easier to do other tasks. All the things that weren't scientific computing or accounting. Those were the big low-hanging fruit in early computing, but by 1964 we wanted to do a lot of other things, including work on smaller computers and different types of environments that we hadn't considered previously. Because, I mean, computers were new, we were doing new things. And that big language, and it's the number 3 language of the early years, unless you include ALGOL, which was kind of important but really fell by the wayside pretty early, so okay, we could maybe include that in one of the granddaddy languages. But by 1964, we had our third really big language, and that was BASIC, Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. BASIC was designed not to actually be so much of a beginner language, but to be a more versatile language, but it was intended to be used in university for learning programming. So it did have a bit of that beginner's connotation in it for real, but mostly I think they put that in just because they wanted to have a cool acronym. BASIC was developed at Dartmouth in 1964, as I said, so it's been around for a long time, and it's gone through a lot of iterations since then. So has Fortran. Fortran today is very dissimilar to Fortran when it originally came out. BASIC in the 1980s became the language for the personal computer space. There were other languages out there, but very few got the acceptance that BASIC did. So we found it during the 8-bit personal computer era, starting with things like the Apple II and the Commodore VIC-20 and 64, and the Ataris, the early Macs, the early Windows PC, and not Windows, the early DOS PCs, they all had BASIC as either built in, or it came with the system, or was assumed that you would be using it at some point. Even through the 16-bit era, with things like the Atari ST and the Commodore Amigas, still BASIC was the common language that they all used. You couldn't share applications between them, their basics were not all the same. But, and this sounds terrible, but the basics were basically the same. BASIC is not a bad language. Coming from that era, Microsoft Windows kind of grew up with this 8-bit, then 16-bit, and 32-bit, and eventually 64-bit history behind it. And unlike other operating systems, for some reason, partially because Bill Gates personally was involved in early basic programming language interpreters for these platforms. So there's a real tie from actual founders that Microsoft started before they made operating systems. They were a basic company. They made basic interpreters. So they have a lot of emotional and historical ties to the language. And there's nothing wrong there. That's great. That was a great place for them to start, and it did really well for them. And BASIC worked great for them over the years. They've always provided their own basic interpreters since day one. Now, as Windows grew up, they needed more and more power from BASIC to do the things that they needed to do, to compete with new languages and new paradigms that were coming out on other platforms. Eventually, BASIC gave way to VisualBasic, which was still basic, just with a lot more stuff added to it and made it more powerful. That ran its course up to VisualBasic 6, and by the end of the VisualBasic era, VB was, as we called it, was actually a pretty solid language and pretty popular and very useful as long as you worked in the Windows space, and mostly if you wanted to build desktop style applications. But a lot of people wanted to do that, so it was a great language for that. VB also branched off into the VBA family, which is used by things like Microsoft Office for automation, and VB Script, which was used for things like operating system automation tasks as a replacement for a script for a shell language. And VB Script also became one of the first languages used in the ASP frameworks for building server-side web applications. So VB was really important up through the later 90s. Coming into the 2000s, some changes came, and the big one was the move from traditional BASIC to the .NET family, where VisualBasic became VisualBasic.NET and became one of a number of languages that shared the common .NET runtime. Its really big and infamous sibling is C#. Now, BASIC does just fine and can do more or less everything that C# can. But a bunch of things have changed over the years, and BASIC has sort of become left behind. So it starts around 2001 to 2002. We started to diverge from the BASIC makes sense for a lot of internal bespoke software development projects. So this is kind of a big era for Microsoft, and Microsoft themselves are part of the ones distancing themselves from BASIC. This is not, the IT industry is not trying to leave Microsoft behind. Microsoft is with us here. They want VB to go away. They don't hate it, and they are kind of emotionally tied to it, and they kind of wish it would drag along, but they also know it's expensive for them to support, and if they could get rid of it, their lives would be a little bit easier. VB is no longer providing any real benefits to Microsoft as a company or to their customers, so Microsoft would like it if it just went away and they could focus on C# and some of the other languages that they have, like F#, which is also an excellent language that runs on the common .NET runtime. So one of the things we want to talk about is what makes BASIC different. And one of those big things is that when it was originally designed, it was based off of Fortran. So Fortran had an early syntax that's a little bit on the weak side and didn't have the benefit of years and decades of language research to make something that was a lot smarter and easier to use. So Fortran syntax tends to be a little bit archaic. It's great for its era. It was the best of its era. It led the charge in making modern software and operating systems and programming languages. So we can't fault Fortran in any way. Fortran did an amazing job. COBOL came after it and didn't learn from it. They didn't learn anything from it. COBOL is a train wreck of syntax. BASIC, when they came out, said, well, let's go back and look at Fortran and make something that mostly mimics Fortran when it can, and when it makes sense. And they did, and that worked. So if you have programmed in Fortran, it is easy to move to BASIC, or vice versa. They share a common background syntax in a lot of ways. Now, over time, that entire syntax family, the Fortran BASIC family, is now considered archaic, and it's really clunky in the modern world. The big thing that replaced it was the C family in the late 1960s. C as a programming language takes a completely different approach to syntax and uses a lot of parentheses and brackets, and it's a little bit more programming language looking, but it's a lot more modern, and if you spend time actually programming, it tends to be a lot more readable and useful. You're spending less time staring at the screen trying to figure out what it does, and a lot less time scrolling around because of just a lot of text sprawling on the screen. So the C family of syntax ended up over time winning out. It took a long time. The 70s and 80s still had the Fortran Basic world with heavy influence, but C just became more and more popular, especially as more other languages began to grow off of it. So we can get into some historical context there about languages, about how C gave birth to C# and Objective-C and C++ and Java, and eventually in some ways JavaScript and a lot of other things just all came from the C family. And that general modernization of the language, of programming languages, took over, and we now see BASIC as a throwback. It's a bit of a vestige that has just hung on. That's kind of the basics. That's why C# is seen as so much better than VisualBasic, even though they both run on the common .NET framework and have the opportunity to use the same modules. So C# is not technically more powerful than VB, but it's more expressive and easier to pass on to someone else to maintain than VB. And that's where things get really important. So the reasons that VB are not considered great is that it no longer has any benefits. Up until VB6, VB was unique in what it offered. So BASIC was really, really important. You just couldn't turn to someone else and get the VB advantages. You could use some tools like Delphi, which is based on Pascal, and get a lot of the VB advantages, but it never got to the same level. VB was the king of making desktop applications in the Windows world for a very long time. But once C# was brought in, and so C# wasn't just brought in to potentially replace VB and run alongside it. Microsoft in the .NET world leads with C#. This is where they do their development, this is where they do their research first. Everything is done around C# and then copied to VB or copied to F# and so forth. So all of the real effort goes into C#. And of course, they make everything available for VisualBasic.NET, but it is still a second-class citizen. They push C# as their agenda and have since day one of having .NET and C#. So living in the Microsoft world makes us need to make the shift to C#. This is not a new thing. This is more than a decade and a half old. So we've had lots of time for the world to adjust to this. It is time for people who've been working in this space to look to C#. If you need to stay in the completely Microsoft world, your languages for the last 15 years have been C# and F#. Some other ones have come and gone, like Microsoft's own Java platform, J#, which was not very popular and did not do very well and made very little sense because it was basically a really weird copy of C# that no one understood. That's gone, but VB.NET needs to go away like that too, and is really only maintained for legacy support. And it's important to understand that. That's why you see so much of it still today, is that there's loads of VB.NET code floating around out there. Microsoft can't just abandon it and stop supporting it and stop updating it, because there's a lot of companies that are invested in it and need to keep it going, and that makes perfect sense for Microsoft. We're not discussing whether or not you should keep maintaining your VB.NET code. Of course, you probably should, unless it's awful. As long as it works and does what you need, keep maintaining it. That's completely logical. But if you're going to be building something new, if you're going to be building a new bespoke application or a new internal application that you have control of those languages, never deploy it on VB. It's time to move past that. C# allows your developers to move faster and be more expressive. They get their ideas across more quickly to the computer and more quickly to each other, and it is easier to get better people who are providing support. And this is one of the biggest things that people don't understand when we say stop using VB. It's because of the human interactions and the ecosystem around it. There's a bunch of key factors that have changed. In the 1990s, you could get really good Visual Basic developers. In fact, a lot of the best people who were into the desktop space were working on VB. So if you wanted the people who were most passionate about those things, that's how you would get them, is by using VB 4, 5, and 6. By the .NET era, that had changed. Passionate Microsoft developers had primarily started to move to C# and some of the other languages, today C# and F#. Over time, that became more and more, and now we are 2 or 3 generations of developers into the C# and F# eras. So we no longer even have the first generation of, well, we're the early adopters into Microsoft's new way of doing things. We are well established that the people that we deal with today going into C#, their mentors were mentored by people who did C# natively and didn't come from the VB era. So we have this ecosystem of C# and F# being where the serious development takes place, and VB mostly exists for old-timers who are supporting old software, or for shops that are confused about how software languages work and think that VB is going to be easier and either do no research or can't tell why the others are better. These are all bad signs. Because of this ecosystem, you have the cobol effect, which is a term I made up, you can't look that up. The cobol effect, as I define it, is the problem that arose around COBOL, that somewhere around the early 1980s, everyone had moved away from COBOL. It was a ridiculous language that was extremely expensive to maintain because you had to hire people who were no longer getting to do the cool work of making awesome new software, but instead were only hiring people to maintain boring old accounting systems, and were forced to work in a language that they hated, because everyone hates COBOL. It's just a hated language. So you're stuck hiring people who are doing work they don't want to do in a language they don't want to work with, and their language and their experience is not building them towards the exciting things they wish they were doing. In order to get people to do this, you only could hire one of two groups. Either people who weren't good enough to do other types of work, and generally that makes them very expensive. Even if they're cheap to pay, they're not worth very much, so COBOL was expensive to maintain. If you wanted to get people who were really good and worked in COBOL, you'd have to pay through the nose, because no one who was good had to work in COBOL. So the only people willing to do it that were good were doing it because the money was so big that they were willing to put up with a language that was awful and doing projects that were boring. This created very, very expensive, high-cost, low-quality code around COBOL. Mostly, you had a large group of low-cost people who weren't doing a good job making code that needed to be fixed by a small group of high-cost people, all of which you could have replaced with half as many medium-cost people in a different environment. So the COBOL effect brings us to VB today. People who are doing VisualBasic pretty much, by and large, are not passionate developers. In the rare case that they are, they're probably old-timers who are looking towards retirement. Maybe not for another 10 years, but you still don't want to be investing in new code in something that's going to have a hard time getting someone to support it in under 10 years. This is a form of technical debt. In fact, this is where the term technical debt comes from, is in software, not in IT. We use it in IT, but we have adopted it from the software world, where bad or old code is a form of technical debt, an investment that you have to overcome later because you're investing against your future. With VB, you're going to find it very difficult to hire passionate, trained developers. People who love to program will have naturally migrated away from VB, either over time because they've had 15 plus years to do this, or they're going to have grown up in a world where VB was not really considered a viable or cool option. It was just an old vestige left around, and they would no more work in VB than they would in COBOL or Fortran or something else. And I say that being someone old enough that when I went to school, it was Fortran that we learned. And my first language was BASIC. So trust me, I understand this emotional tie to the languages we grew up with. I miss programming in BASIC. I miss programming in Fortran. Both were great languages in their time for the things we needed to do. Today, they just don't make sense for really anything. So this is important to understand. It's not that VB is a terrible language. It's not that it used to be a terrible language. It's that it's a terrible choice of languages, and we need to avoid it for business, not technical purposes. We want to be able to get good developers who do good work, who can pass off their work to other developers to support cost effectively and designed for the future rather than for the past. We want to avoid technical debt and invest in ways of building software that simply makes sense. So don't take it as an emotional, oh, it's terrible that people have done VB in the past. That's not how it is. It's simply that VB for the last 12 to 15 years has not made sense, and every day it makes less sense than it did previously. It is time to move past and pick new languages. All of that is compounded by the fact that VB only exists on the .NET platform. And the .NET platform, while technically open and available on different operating systems and in different places, is still extremely limited and focused on the Windows ecosystem. This means that even within the .NET world, people who are doing the most passionate work, which is typically F#, and people who are doing nearly the most passionate work, which tend towards C#, will still be within a subset of developers who are mostly tied to Windows, which is a pretty big subset of overall developers. If programming is your passion and you're less vendor specific, you are more likely to work in languages like Java, JavaScript and Node, Ruby, Python, and so forth, and Google Go now being very large. These languages are platform agnostic, and so if your focus is programming rather than being Windows focused, you're much more likely to do one of those languages. So you already have a certain disadvantage in hiring developers when you move to .NET in any way whatsoever, because you're picking a platform that ties them to something arbitrarily that a developer would not naturally want to be tied to, because that's not the thing they're passionate about. So they're passionate about being able to make the code and being able to make the software with the code. So once you have a double subset of moving to the .NET platform and then moving to that tiny subset of VB within that platform, you have people who have embraced Windows, but embraced Windows only in a legacy context. That gives you a really bad potential subset of people who are experienced with VB. Of course, anyone who's done C#, anyone who's done F#, they're going to have no problem writing VB code for you from a technical standpoint. But are you going to want to pay them? Are they going to be happy doing that work? Not very likely. You're going to have to pay a premium to convince them to work on that code. It's not the only factor, of course. If you're the only job in town, that you're just the right fit for them, that won't be the thing that stops them 99.9% of the time. But it will be a negative factor, and there's no reason for you to have that negative factor. VB doesn't offer some benefit. It is not easier to use. It's not easier to read. It's not faster to develop. There's no positives to VB. There are solid negatives that get worse every day, and that's why we're so adamant about not choosing VisualBasic, because there's just always a better choice. A choice that's cheaper, a choice that doesn't cost more, a choice that uses the same platform, a choice that gives you platform agnosticism. Lots of great things. Stay away from VB. It just doesn't make sense for your project. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe. Comment below. Are you working on VB? How are you moving away from VB? Have you done a migration project? What languages are you considering? Do you need guidance on what languages and platforms make sense in the modern world? Put that in the comments below, and remember to support us on Patreon.